Ow! That's not very fair! Well, here we go! Nope. Welcome back to the Mental Roulette grind. This time we're back with more stream highlights with a new job for every duty on the Friday evening of the first week of 7.3. And this set is much closer to what I had expected during the mock tome period, but nope, here it is 1 week after. And for duty 1 we have Castrum Meridianum as monk, which depending on your preferences of course can both be great or really awkward. But it is a pretty good duty to demonstrate how to make the best use of perfect balance at level 50 as a monk. I've explained this in more detail in other videos, but the long story short is that the power difference between your single target 3 combo steps as a monk in this level range is so tiny that it doesn't really make much of a difference which step you do use. Sure, bootshine auto crits, but on average, the other options do just about the same damage anyway. In fact, depending on how high your crit stat is, the snap punch step can be the superior option. This is also considering chakra gains, by the way. What this means is that perfect balance doesn't really do anything for you. Maybe a minuscule damage gain if you use the optimal choice. But then, without Masterful Blitz, it leaves you without form at the end, and using Dragon Kick without form is effectively a 200 potency loss, which is negatively impactful as opposed to the rather unimpactful gain Perfect Balance can offer. In other words, before you get Masterful Blitz at level 60, it is actually superior to just not use Perfect Balance on single target. On the other hand, AoE is a whole different story. While Armor the Destroyer without form is 10 potency less than with form, Rockbreaker is 30 more potency than in form arm, so chaining perfect balances on AoE is actually a very significant gain, big enough to easily overwhelm the loss induced by it. In fact, a single perfect balance adds up to about 40 AoE potency gained at the cost of 10 AoE potency loss later, which is a net 30 AoE potency gained. And conveniently, the bosses in this duty take long enough for you to refresh perfect balance. That said, this doesn't change the fact Monk mostly boils down to 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 at 50. But the duty went well. For duty 2, we went back for more Castrum Meridianum, this time as Samurai. This has a bit more meat on it of course, but Samurai at this level doesn't have some janky detail about some weirdly unhelpful cooldown, so we just try to maintain Higanbana on bosses, and when there is AoE to be done, Tenkagoken. In fact, this run took about 12 seconds less than the previous one, so obviously this group was supremely superior to the previous one. I'm kidding. A random tip about Samurai at this level is that if you can line it up such that you spend a Sen from Yukikaze to reapply Higanbana, that can of course save some time, leading to possibly more Midara Setsugekas. However, making sure Higanbana is maintained and that Make Your Shisui doesn't sit ready for too long tends to be more valuable than making sure you spend the perfectly most optimal Zen when you just need one. And of course, just to not add to the confusion, if you need a Sen for Higanbana during Make Your Shisui, obviously use Gekko or Kasha for that. They do more damage than Yukikaze. For duty 3, we went to aggressive groups as machinist. In hindsight, I should have saved my initial hotshot, as the extremely short length of the duty means we only get one reassemble and one hotshot. And in this level range, hotshot is the best GZD we have. Reassembled hotshot to the Gobu, anyone? Oh well, slugshot it is then. We don't even have AoE. For duty 4, we went to bringing Vedal to his lunch as Reaper. I guess it might be worth mentioning that Shadow of Death is worth using on a mob as long as they live long enough for 2 additional GZDs in this level range, which hilariously means like just the turtle. We of course quickly clean up here. For duty 5, we are an instant replacement in Ultimate Weapon Extreme as Black Mage, and we start off by being sucker punched. Very fair and fun. At least we lived it. For our first attempt, we make it to the first orbs, which are resolved, although with a death. Simultaneously, our paladin tank didn't react to the warrior's request for a tank switch, and so the warrior died from the debuff. For the second set of orbs, we have a healer die, and I used my mana ward to take an orb as well, but we survived. However, the third set of orbs spawn in with 2 players already dead, and we end up taking too long to resolve them, letting the fourth pair of orbs connect. For those that don't know these things causing us problems, while the boss doesn't hit the tank that hard, it applies a stacking debuff, and when it hits 5 stacks, you just straight up die. And there's nothing you can do to avoid it, aside from not hitting 5 stacks in the first place. The orbs, when touched, explode as a shared AoE in a medium-sized circle around them, and will typically kill any non-tank outright if they take it alone with no help, meaning it is usually best to take the orbs as a pair. Also, it kills through invuln. When one of the orbs in a tether is dealt with, the other despawns on its own shortly after. If 2 orbs manage to connect to each other, it is an immediate party wipe, meaning, if that is what it takes, throwing yourself at the orb to save the team is a viable strategy. I explained these mechanics of the orbs to the party for the second try, with notably the Dragoon asking for further clarification. For the first set of orbs, I take an orb with said Dragoon, while a healer and machinist also takes one. The tanks also took that one, but still. For the second set, I take an orb with the Dragoon again, and also take one with Mana Ward alongside the Machinist and Healer, while our Warrior takes the third one. For the final set, I and the Healer end up dropping into 2 orbs for the greater good. We aren't the only ones, and nearly half the raid dies, but the orbs are gone, and this position is winnable with just the tanks still standing. Also note that the Paladin tank swapped correctly this time. Well done, team! For duty 6, we went to Strayborough Deadwalk as Viper, and what is of course most interesting for this one is always the Mad Hatter. When you have a more quote-unquote balanced team with a ranged DPS in it, the healer and ranged can work together to make the dashing children move more predictably. This is done by having these players stand on opposing ends of the arena while the rest stand in the center, as the children will, in the first 2 waves, start by running at the furthest away player, followed by the closest. However, in a team with double melees, this gets more complicated. Now, making use of Uncoiled Fury, I attempt to stand in as that ranged DPS, but I don't move to the correct edge. But do take note that this is something you can do as a Viper. I should have gone to the north edge of the arena opposing the healer. Aside from that, having a coil or 2 on hand so it is more easy to dodge the children when or if they run through the boss is always a solid option. Admittedly, this whole mechanic is significantly easier for me due to a good and reliable connection, but still, steering clear of the path of as many children as possible helps make it more consistent. While we do pick up some vuln stacks here and there, it appears no one got hatted. The rest of the duty goes about as expected with no deaths. For duty 7, we went to the Council of Gargoyles as Sage. The best advice I can really give here is try to work together with your team. If everyone's holding back the damage, do that too. If everyone is attacking, it might actually be for the best to just bring it. Get the mobs to respawn sooner rather than later. Although, in this team, we went so hard on the mobs that I'd wager we almost saw them respawn again. For duty 8, we went to A11N, Alexander's Cruise Chaser, as Pectomancer. This job is actually quite interesting in a duty like this. You can use the initial packs to set yourself up to have both a Mog of the Ages and a Winged Muse ready to go for the boss fight, not to mention Gage to lead with Subtractive Palette. On the other hand, you yourself don't have a raid buff yet, making a rotation a lot more freeform. In this party here, the only raid buffs we have come from the Astrologian anyway. With the somewhat recent buffs to Hammer Stamp again, this is also definitely something that should be used on cooldown. However, a particular tip about Striking Muse in the levels where you don't have 2 charges on it yet is that Striking Muse gives you 30 seconds to spend them, so as long as you know you can spend them within that time frame, using it on cooldown still gives you the flexibility to use this mobility when you need it. Mostly. Now, in regards to specifically Cruise Chaser, I have a couple tips. The first one, which is probably obvious, but just to be sure, when the boss becomes untargetable initially, make sure to use one of the open ducts or you will die. And then make sure to press a button for the QuickTime event, or you will die. The second tip is when Cruise Chaser summons this plasma shield. Not only is Cruise Chaser invulnerable, but the shield can, strangely, only be attacked from the front. I often see a lot of players not realizing this. I have also seen some players that play with damage numbers hidden. I highly recommend turning them back on, as otherwise you might not notice when your attacks fail in this way. Aside from these tips, most of the other attacks the boss has have ways to minimize their danger, but none of them seems to one-shot, so you can usually kinda wing it. For my own mistakes, I now realize that I ended up using an odd number of Living Muses, which to my knowledge is still a damage loss in this level range. How will I ever recover from this? For duty 9, we went to A2N, the Alexander Mob Rush, as Red Mage. There's this pack before the boss room, quote-unquote, with a couple snipers in it that technically you could just run past. However, I think at some point in Dawntrail, these snipers were fixed so that they will actually chase you down and will not reset when you go into the next room after the lever, meaning it is a good idea to stand and fight them, especially because way too often have I seen whoever ended up with aggro on them just dying off to a severe case of no heals. In the perfect world, you could send one player ahead to press the lever in the next room while the rest fights off the snipers, but good luck with getting that to work consistently. We of course deal with the mob rush itself nicely. For duty 10, we went to Friendly Strike Force as Bard. Here I made the mistake of using Raging Strikes before the Gobu. Not that it really mattered. Another detail is that the Gobu died just around the 5th tick of Venomous Bite, which puts its damage barely above Heavy Shot. You know, I could see a justification to just not bother putting up the dot to begin with. For duty 11, we went to Copperbell Mines as Warrior. This dungeon has this weird jank with it that many mobs will reset if you run too far away, which, while sure, certain other A Realm Reborn dungeons sometimes has this too, Copperbell Mines is particularly obnoxious about it. Speaking of which, there is this section in the dungeon with the 2 side rooms where you need the fire sand from the blasting caps. Usually I find most or all groups will deal with each pack one at a time, specifically because the packs tend to reset when you try to stack them together. However, Flamin' Knight in the live chat pointed out that there is a way to pull both packs that works even if you're alone at it. Simply pull one pack with a ranged attack, then pull the other with a ranged attack, while being careful to not run too far down the tunnel to either side, and also being fast so the pack already chasing you doesn't have to chase you too far. This way you can fight both packs in the center room. We tested this rigorously after the dungeon, and indeed the packs reset just about when they take one proper step down the tunnel to the opposing room, so pulling the packs from the center room works. Enjoy this random optimization tip. One other thing that happened in this run was that when I did the Gigapull at the start of the dungeon, I don't think my party realized this, as each of them fell further behind than the last, which culminated in me finishing the pull by doing a curved path and running back towards my party to survive. Remember, kiting works, and we survived. For DD12, we went to I Guy and the Voidy Boys as Dragoon. Not that much to say here, we've been here before somewhat recently as Dragoon. Make sure to make all those initial cooldowns count, as you may not get a second use. For duty 13, we went to Porta Decumana as Astrologian. This team was very solid, so there isn't that much to say for the duty as a whole, it just went well. For Astrologian, I have 2 tips, one general and one for this specific fight. For the specific fight, there is a significant amount of unavoidable AoE damage in the fight, so you will probably have to do some AoE healing. But if your team is reliable, using Aspected Helios when everyone drops below like half tends to be very good use of your time. The more general tip is that many Astrologians have trouble with the classic 2-minute burst setup, quote-unquote, for the job, because it is hard to fit everything in there. When Divination is about to be ready, if you still have any defensive cards in hand, throw them on someone, probably the tank. Then, about 1 or 2 GZDs before Divination is ready, or even when it is ready, weave Lightspeed and then get to weaving Divination. For every GZD, you now have space to weave 2 things, assuming a decent connection of course, allowing you to play your damage card, draw a new hand, and then play your other damage card. This is even more helpful at higher levels where you may have even more stuff you want to get done. While it is nice to save light speed for movement, you do have 2 charges for a reason. At least use one of them for the burst, unless you know you will need it elsewhere. For duty 14, we went to Tender Valley as Summoner. One main tip for synced content as Summoner is to always make sure at least one item in your gear inherently has spell speed, so you can still fit 6 astral impulses when synced down. In relation to 7.3 Summoner buffs, some of you may have paid mind to the fact that specifically Titan didn't really receive much on single target buffs, while the 2 other summons did. If you're curious what this means for the job's optimization, it mostly means that under very specific circumstances, Garuda First may be optimal. But aside from that, Titan First seems to still be the safe bet. Sometimes a boss fight may motivate you to put Ifrit during buffs to not be forced to use it during a movement mechanic or something, and in those cases, the buffs make it hurt less, one could say. Oh, and one last tip that I may have mentioned before, long-range jobs can completely ignore the sideline AoEs on this last AoE pull by simply standing at almost max range from the big mini-boss guy. Assuming you aren't about to use Ifrit, Summoner can make use of this cheeky save spot. The duty, of course, went very well. For duty 15, we went to another rehearsal with Guy and the Voidy Boys as Dancer. The main things to do here as a Dancer is to pre-cast standard steps so you can maybe get more standard finishes in the fight. Also, Fan Dance 1 is available. And finally, take note that standard step into finish does take 2 whole GCDs worth of time for its payoff, so if the fight is about to end, you could just not bother. Aside from that, make use of your ranged capability to avoid being hit by avoidable AoEs. For duty 16, we went to Tower of Babil as Scholar. I have 2 tips for both the second and last bosses here. For the second boss, you are, obviously, meant to use the mini platform when the chakrams are incoming. However, the mini effect actually only reduces your damage output by like 10% or so. So if you're a less mobile job like a caster, simply standing your ground and removing the effect when both waves are over is probably better. For more mobile jobs, you can be cheeky and switch between big and small as you need it. For the poison gas section, remember that the debuff doesn't really harm you unless you hit 8 stacks. So I usually switch to Frog at about 5 or 6 stacks to not get too greedy, and then immediately switch out of Frog again as the mechanic dishes out about 10 to 12 stacks in total. So by simply resetting once in the middle, you can continue your attack for the rest of it. Also, do keep in mind the slowing effect. For the final boss, my first tip is that the chains from Mega Graviton can be negated with knockback immunity. Not everyone realizes this. The second tip is that the chasing claws in the intermission will chase you for a shorter distance than the whole width of the arena. So if you place the first AoE on the far left and just run over to the far right immediately, then the claw will never reach you. This makes the AoEs much easier to deal with. Not that they were that hard to begin with necessarily, but still. For duty 17, we went to Castrum Meridianum. Again, as Paladin. Oh yeah, and Naomi from my raid team is also here. I've already glazed up how crazy Paladin's AoE is in this level range relative to the other tanks, and this party was, of course, also very solid. So solid, in fact, that we finished nearly a minute and a half faster than the Samurai run earlier. Although, that might actually be more because we have a Dancer, and Dancer's busted in this level range. Anyway, we beat it very quickly. And finally for duty 18, we went to Halatali as White Mage. As I see both a Pugilist Sprout and the Warrior being a Sprout, I am being a bit extra careful to guide wherever needed, without being commanding. For instance, I lean towards the correct path forward, but follow whenever the Warrior pulls something else. I make sure to use the winches so they aren't forgotten. After the first boss, I also paid extra close attention to the Pugilist when they took a while to arrive to make sure they used the blue fire. A pretty solid Halatali run, I would say. By the way, did you know that Summoner can solo Halatali synced? Another solid set of duties. I am considering switching jobs less frequently during these live streams to give each job we do draw a bit of room to breathe, but let's see what I do about it. We also reached 12/25 on the achievement. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, while Cruise Chaser clearly fits in with the whole Alexander design, it is actually a reference to a much older Square game from before Square Enix, called Cruise Chaser Blasty. Apparently, both attack names and other enemies in the fight are references to this other game.